I think we can say that it's a luxury in life when you have a goal and you can just relentlessly march toward your goal. More often, it's a balancing act. You know you have to claw your way out of the frying pan, but you really don't want to go out of the frying pan and into the fire. The US Fed is in that situation right now. They have to hike rates to control inflation, but that could also overinflate unemployment and wreck the asset markets, including crypto. On the micro scale in our Cardano neck of the woods, we want the mainstream adoption that could accompany regulation. But we don't want to be regulated into a centralized, permissioned monstrosity we don't even recognize. We want ADA holders to have self governance, but we don't want Binance and Coinbase to be the biggest voters at the polls. The world and Cardano have got some things to figure out. Ready? Let's go. Today, we are going to discuss the tightrope being traversed by the central banks of the world at the macro level and simultaneously by Cardano at the micro level. A big hearing today on crypto in DC, and this one is actually intended to go our way. And a crypto critic suddenly getting a taste of why crypto is so important. If you're as disturbed as I am at AI's unfortunate construction of the left lapel and the entirely missing tail of the tie here, or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. Oh man, guys. Oh man, it's been a tough couple of days for our main bro, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking to yourself, hey man, I'm a crypto bro. He's not my bro. Jerome Powell's not my bro. I'm a crypto bro. I know. If you are a crypto person, you are sort of like naturally disinclined toward anyone having to do with any kind of central bank, federal or otherwise, any central bank. You're not necessarily thinking of them as your best friend. I would say that Jerome Powell is probably the best Federal Reserve chairman we've had at communicating what is actually going on at the Fed to the general public. He definitely has some kind of a gift for communicating, these very high level issues to normal Americans. Like, you can watch these committee hearings with Jerome Powell and you can actually understand what he's saying. A lot of times much better than the Congress people and the senators asking him the questions. So I do like Jerome Powell. He's much better to watch and to consume information from than a lot of previous Federal Reserve chairpersons. However, I will once again reiterate my main complaint against Jerome Powell. Look at the way he's perched behind that microphone. Look at the eyebrows. Look at the silveriness. I will once again express my belief that at least one of his great-grandparents was an owl of some kind. Here's how I think it went down. And I don't want to blame everything on us dudes, but come on. It was probably one of his great-grandfathers out taking a stroll in the woods one night when, probably midnight or later, he ran into a lady owl and there was some kind of a romantic interlude. I'm not saying it was non-consensual, but I am asking, how do you consent if you're an owl? Is it like that under the bathroom stall thing, like tap your claw 3 times? Anyway, regardless of any avian lineage, I do like Jay Powell. I would say that Jerome Powell is a pretty good Federal Reserve chairman. Of course, in crypto, we don't want our money to be central bank money, so we'd rather not have anyone in charge of our money like this at all. But I'm saying if we are going to have somebody, Jerome Powell, not too bad. I don't agree with the policy of the Federal Reserve. I'm not in favor of what they do largely, because I think what we have going on here, the reason the Federal Reserve and the United States and the entire world are in this let's get out of the frying pan, but let's not end up in the fire situation, is because we've engaged in this modern economic theory thing where we have completely ignored the lessons the Austrian economists tried to teach to us. It's like, von Mises, we don't care. We don't care what you thought. We don't care at all. We're just going to do this modern central bank thing where anytime any kind of economic trouble comes along, we just start printing money. And I know to people in crypto, this is like, it becomes like trite information because we talk about it so much. But there is a big difference between an Austrian economics world that I think a lot of us in crypto believe in, or at least are sympathetic to, or think there might be some wisdom in that approach. I think it's a very different world. Now we're in this situation where inflation has been sky high for a long time. And of course, at first they told us it was transitory, nothing to worry about. And then it was persistent. And now we're in open economic warfare against inflation. And, from the start, when they first started, this expansive policy of printing money and super low interest rates, this easy money era we've been in for a long time, and was kind of only accelerated when the medical situation came along. I'm not sure if we can even say that these days and not get some kind of advisory. We've been in that era of easy money for a long time. And now, of course, what a lot of Austrian economists would have predicted is happening to us. We end up in this situation where we have to hike rates because they kept rates so low. Austrian economists would argue, abnormally low, artificially low for so long, this era of free money. Now we have all this sky high inflation. So what do they have to do? They have to hike rates. But when you start hiking rates, and this was a big part of all the discussions in both the House and the Senate hearings. Senate was yesterday, House was today. For you, that's yesterday as you listen to this. A lot of the questions were, hey, I know we're all trying to combat inflation, but if you keep hiking rates like it sounds like you're going to do, then we're going to have really much, much higher unemployment. And what happens to the asset markets? Like the real estate market was one of the first things that came up. And that's kind of that's where you really get into this catch-22, because the members of the House, and I think some of the senators too, were asking him questions like, hey, as you hike rates, it means that mortgage rates go up, and that makes it harder for first-time home buyers to afford these houses. And Powell is caught in this difficult situation where he's like, well, yeah, that's, largely true. But also at the same time, we've had this runaway appreciation of home prices kind of across the country that was due to our whole easy money era we were in, that got even easier kind of as the health situation came along for those couple of years. This is exactly the situation the Austrian economists were trying to warn us against. They were trying to keep us out of this situation without doing this tampering with the interest rate all the time to optimize all the time. What happens is, and I know this is something we talk about all the time in crypto, but we end up sort of kicking the can down the road. It's like, let's just ease money for a while. We'll deal with this later. Now is later. Now we're in this catch-22. Now we're trying to get out of the frying pan, and it's like, oh, we're going to get out of the frying pan of inflation and end up in the fire of high unemployment and wrecked asset markets. Unfortunately, those wrecked asset markets include crypto. So nobody can predict exactly what's going to happen. We can see that by looking at the dot plot from the Federal Reserve. All the people involved in the FOMC meetings, and we've shown them on this channel many times, they predict where they think interest rates are going to be, and they're often wrong. These are some of the best economists in the world. They are often wrong. And you could chalk some of that up to the flawed thinking, that results in the central bank behavior we see today. That's in a lot of ways quite contrary to the Austrian economics view of the world. Or you could just say nobody can really predict the future. I believe both are true. I believe nobody can predict the future, and I believe the Austrian economists were right about a lot of things. But it's going to have an impact on all of us over the foreseeable future, and it's going to affect us in crypto as well. That's all on the macro scale. But what we see is that crypto is also experiencing its own little out of the frying pan into the fire catch-22 situation. And we even see this in our own neck of the woods in Cardano. But before we talk about Cardano, we got to talk about what we learned from Powell over the last 2 days. So before we get to some of Powell's answers to questions from these 2 days of committee hearings, it's important to know that he's a part of this group, the President's Working Group on Financial Markets. And this group seems to be ground zero for crypto hate in the Biden administration. So 50% of this group is Janet Yellen and Gensler. So the rumor that I keep seeing over and over again is that Janet Yellen is very, very anti-crypto. Then you've got Gensler, obviously very anti-crypto. Then you've got the chair of the CFTC, and then you've got Powell. And this group is where the stablecoin paper came from and all of the talking points on crypto about fraud and criminal activity, and instability and all these negative things about crypto that we keep seeing them repeat with exactly the same language. It all seems to be emanating out of this group. This is the group that's sort of been tasked with the anti-crypto agenda, as near as I can tell. If you question why anyone would ever think that Janet Yellen could be anti-crypto, you need to only look at her Wikipedia page. If we scroll down here to the after the Federal Reserve section of her Wikipedia entry, we see between 2018 and 2020, Yellen received over $7 million in speaking fees from financial companies such as Barclays, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, and Citadel after leaving the Federal Reserve. With her return to government, she pledged to get official permission from the Office of Government Ethics to participate in substantive issues involving such firms to avoid any conflict of interest. So think about this. She got $7 million just for giving speeches in front of groups like Goldman. You think Brian Armstrong is going to give her $7 million? You think Jesse Powell? You think CZ? You think they're going to give her any millions of dollars? No, they're out to disintermediate her. They're going to give her negative dollars. She's not getting $7 million from Jesse Powell, Brian Armstrong, and CZ. That money is in the TradFi world. There's no money for her in the crypto world. I'm not saying this is why she's tough on crypto, but I'm saying she's got 7 million reasons to be tough on crypto. Interestingly, Powell doesn't seem personally to be that anti-crypto, at least not in these hearings. A couple different times, he was basically asked, hey, wouldn't it be good if there was some kind of a transparent, clear regulatory or legal framework for crypto so that both the users of crypto and companies in crypto would understand, what the legal framework is here? And he didn't seem to hesitate too much. He just said, yeah. And he said that was at one point he, straight up implied that would be the role of Congress, that Congress needed to pass a regulatory framework. He didn't hesitate and say, maybe the SEC just promulgates, its own regulations. He said, no. He was asked, should we have such a framework? And he said, yes. And basically, that is the role of Congress. Congress needs to do that. That is something that Congress should do. That's a pretty crypto-friendly. In fact, one of those questions was from Senator Lummis, and that's a pretty crypto-friendly answer. And she responded, yes, Senator Gillibrand and I agree. Of course, she was referencing the Lummis-Gillibrand bill, which would have been a pretty crypto-friendly bill. Of course, it didn't pass. I was showing you Congressman Hill there because he asked a similar question, but Lummis, who you can see right now, also went on to ask about stable coins in particular. And she got Powell to agree that if we had an appropriate regulatory framework for stablecoins, there could be a role for stablecoins in our financial system, which, even though that sounds like a small thing, we haven't really been able to get anybody in that president's working group to say that before. Not so directly. I mean, the kind of rhetoric we get out of Yellen and Gensler is basically just, hey, we want you to comply with a bunch of regulations that there's no way you can comply with. So basically, it's like they're saying crypto can just go away and die. Crypto can just crawl into a cave and die. That's what they would really seem to really like. Not the case with Powell. Powell seems to believe that stable coins could have a role in the traditional finance world and what would become a modern finance world if crypto and TradFi were allowed to commingle in a reasonable way. And he also believes that Congress should pass a reasonable legal framework for regulatory clarity in crypto. Some other questions from other members of Congress gave us a little clarity about the Fed's CBDC plans. So it sounds like they're kind of all in on wholesale CBDC. So a central bank digital currency for settling trades between banks. But on the topic of a retail CBDC, Powell said that's something they're doing some technology type research on, but there are big policy questions. Like he says, the Fed doesn't even know if the United States citizens want or need a retail CBDC. So this was actually good news. When I heard this was good news. He's saying that the Fed isn't sure if the US should have a retail CBDC or even if it needs a retail CBDC. And importantly, he used the verb want. He said he doesn't know if the US citizens want a retail CBDC. And he also said that the Fed would not go ahead with any kind of retail CBDC without the express consent and permission of Congress. Like Congress would have to give the Fed the power to create a retail CBDC. So it sounds like we hear a lot about the Fed and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston working with the MIT Media Lab on CBDCs. But it sounds like if Powell's to be trusted on this, and I think he probably is, that what they're really into is that wholesale CBDC. And they're just kind of like, gathering information about technologically how a retail CBDC would work. But they're not even sure if that's something that the US would ever want or need, or even if Congress would ever give them permission to do that. So I think that should relax the concerns of a lot of crypto. Again, not saying that the US federal government has never turned around and done exactly the opposite of what they said they were doing, but this should relax some people. In one of the most entertaining moments of the entire 2 days of hearings, Congressman Davidson proved to be a great ally of crypto on two different points in his questions with Chair Powell. So first, he started talking about choke point 2.0, and he asked Chairman Powell to look into it, to the extent that the Federal Reserve has some bank regulatory functions. So you probably already know this, but choke point 2.0 is the nickname a lot of us in crypto and some other people elsewhere have given to the recent obvious efforts of federal bank regulators to exert pressure on those banks to sever their banking relationships with crypto companies. This is named after Operation Choke Point, which happened in a previous administration where the same thing happened, but not with crypto. It was with other businesses in other industries that were politically unfavored by that administration. So they're calling this time it's crypto, so they're calling it Operation Choke Point 2.0. Congressman Davidson asked Jay Powell to look into it, which is kind of funny because that he's sitting in this president's working group with Yellen and Gensler. And they're, my guess would be that they're sitting around figuring out how to most effectively execute on Choke Point 2.0. So there's a little bit of theater here, Davidson talking about Choke Point 2.0 and asking, Powell to look into it when Powell is in the working group that's probably responsible for most of it, probably strategizing how to do it most effectively. And then Congressman Davidson went on to ask Powell about some comments he made, I believe in the Senate hearing, where Powell kind of said, hey, these permissionless public blockchains are kind of a problem for financial stability. They're the thing that's potentially the big danger for financial instability. And Davidson said, hey, a lot of us were alarmed by your remarks because permissionless public blockchains are what crypto is all about, basically. I'm putting words in his mouth, but that was basically the sentiment, to which Powell did the thing you would expect from a guy who's in the president's working group with Yellen and Gensler. He said, hey, if you look at our, papers we've put out, we've said we don't want to strangle innovation and, all these things. But hey, these public permissionless blockchains, there's so much. And then he started talking about fraud and criminal activity, to which Davidson had a very, very good response. And I'm really glad this is proliferating throughout Congress, because this is a great way to shut down that talking point that's obviously coming out of that president's working group. He said, hey, we have this study that shows that 0.2% of all the activity on the public permissionless blockchains is fraudulent or criminal in any way. And that's less than the amount of fraud and crime involving the dollar. And I believe that Powell knew about this study, because he didn't object or try to argue at all. He's normally very polite in these hearings, as he was here, as was Davidson, but he didn't try to argue that or clarify or add any caveats or anything. He was just like, okay. I think this is great that Congress is starting to understand that this, hey, crypto is a den of fraud and criminal behavior kind of thing, that talking point gets shut down when you point out that you're really talking about 0.2% of all the volume on permissionless public blockchains. So we learned a few things from Powell over the last 2 days. What does all this mean for Cardano? Well, we're currently obviously in a very big crypto bear market, but Powell's basically telling us, hey, inflation is still too high. We're going to continue hiking rates. So no relief from the Fed is really on the horizon for our bear market problem. But then we've also got the regulatory problem, in that Powell and the rest of the president's working group on financial markets, they are strongly of the position that these permissionless public blockchains, the thing that we think is so genius about crypto, is a source of financial instability for the greater markets, and kind of sounds like they think it needs to be snuffed out. But at the same time, it's possible that Powell is the most understanding of crypto in this president's working group, because at the same time, he also says, hey, if there was a decent regulatory framework for stablecoins, they could have a place in the mainstream financial system. And also, Congress should pass a comprehensive regulatory legal framework for crypto. That would be a good thing for the crypto companies and the users. So Powell, I think he's definitely been sitting around with Yellen and Gensler and hearing their rhetoric about crypto, which is not positive. But at the same time, he seems to be open-minded about a world where there is clear regulation for crypto. So that's all happening at the macro level, nationally, with ripple effects internationally. That's all going on. For us in Cardano at the micro level, everything right now seems to be about this SIP 1694 and Voltaire, which we've covered a few times in a lot of depth in the last couple of weeks. But I've noticed over the last couple of days, some portion of the debate has started focusing on what I think right now is one of the more interesting parts of all this. And that's what I talked about in the last big video I did on Voltaire. But I've noticed people are focusing a lot more on this question. It's a similar situation, a similar catch-22. We want to give self-rule to the ADA holders. But at the same time, it is a little bit of an out of the frying pan into the fire kind of thing, because we want to get out of this, albeit benevolent rule by this triumvirate of benevolent rulers, the founding entities, and into, self-rule by the ADA holders. But the biggest ADA holders are like Binance and Coinbase. So we have this problem where the Binances and Coinbase, we want to give the ADA holders the ability, a lot of power in this column, the DREP column right here, which we've talked about in detail in previous videos. But at the same time, if the criteria is holding ADA, then that means some of the most powerful voters at the polls are going to be Binance and Coinbase. That's if we don't come up with some mechanism to somehow prevent the centralized exchanges from voting their users' tokens, but probably whatever mechanism accomplishes that breaks permissionlessness in one or many ways. What I think is more interesting here is, okay, it's probably difficult to separate out and prevent the vote of the centralized exchanges in this column. But in this column, the SPO column, I think what we really have to be careful of, and I tried to make this point in my last video on this, but we have to be really careful to not give those same centralized exchanges double votes, like double very powerful votes, because they're probably going to have very powerful votes in this column. We don't also want to make this column over here, the SPO column, so powerful that it's like Binance and Coinbase and the centralized exchanges and other centralized entities have a huge amount of voting power here. And then we give too much power to the SPOs over here. And they also have way too much power over here. Because let's face it, they are gigantic holders for purposes of this column. They're also gigantic stake pool operators for purposes of this column. So I think the one thing we need to be careful of is, and I think, I honestly think, 1492, which is shown here, I think the heart of 1492 is shown in this table. I think it's the best stab at Cardano governance I've seen. It's the best, starting place for Cardano governance I've seen, because it doesn't give too much power to the SPOs over here in this column. But I've seen a lot of people talk about their own sort of alternate ideas about how governance should work, and almost every single one of them seem to increase the power of the stake pool operators. I would argue that's a vote multiplier for the Coinbases and Binances, whose power we probably want to minimize. We want to minimize the power of those entities because they're not really native citizens of Cardano. You could argue that centralized exchanges like Kraken and Binance were at least friendly to us by listing us earlier, but Coinbase, they didn't even list ADA until recently. You think they care about Cardano? You think they care about policy issues in Cardano? No. Would they exercise their votes? Probably. I mean, if they're, normal, if it's a normal self-interested corporation, I think we can count on them doing the self-interested thing, which is exercise their votes in the way that's most beneficial to them. But they're not exactly native parts of our ecosystem. They wouldn't even list us. They wouldn't even list ADA until comparatively recently compared to Binance and Kraken. So I think we got to be careful. We got to be really careful about this column right over here. It is an out of the frying pan into the fire question. We want to get out of this fry pan. We want to get out of the fry pan of not having self-rule, but at the same time, we don't want to create self-rule that means that these centralized entities have way too much power. Here's something you love to see. Remember this guy, Paul Krugman? This is the guy that once said something like, in the early days of the internet, he said something like, the impact of the internet at the end of the day will not be much more than that of the fax machine, right? Obviously, the wrongest dude ever. He is the wrongest dude when it comes to any kind of technology that interfaces with commerce. So he also said this about crypto. Cryptocurrency lets you make electronic transactions, but so do bank accounts, debit cards, PayPal, Venmo, etc. All these other methods involve trusting a third party, but unless you're buying drugs, assassinations, etc., that's not a big deal. Obviously, not a very pro-crypto guy, which is why you love to see what came next. Today, he posted this: too busy to tweet, but not to vent. I've been using Venmo for years, but now it won't allow me to make payments. I spent a long time in chat with representatives, and they told me that they can't explain why or fix it. The software has taken control. Obviously, there's a contradiction between his position that you wouldn't care about a centralized payment platform unless you're trying to buy drugs or buy some kind of assassination. So people were quick to point this out. This poster said, "Were you trying to buy drugs or assassination?" This is the whole deal with decentralized platforms versus centralized platforms. People don't care about decentralization until they're the ones that the centralized platform is not allowing on the platform. Finally, something awesome is happening today. So that House committee that Powell was in today is chaired by Patrick McHenry, who is very pro-crypto. He's definitely one of our allies in Congress. And they're having another hearing today called here called Coincidence or Coordinated: The Administration's Attack on the Digital Asset Ecosystem. So you can tell this hearing was not orchestrated by the same party as the current administration in the White House. This is the other party that is holding this hearing, but this is obviously about Choke Point 2.0 that we're talking about. Coincidence or coordinated? And the witnesses are the CEO of BitGo, a professor from Penn State Law, a partner at Jones Day, and Paul Gruel, the chief legal officer at Coinbase. You've seen me talk about his tweets on this channel. I think he's going to have a lot of good things to say. This is the top attorney at Coinbase. I think he's going to have some very interesting things to say to the committee. And then we've also got a policy director from Duke. So I think this is going to be a very interesting hearing. I think you're going to get some sound bites in this hearing that definitely make some accusations about what the White House is doing to crypto right now. I'm going to look forward to watching this. I hope you're having a great week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.